Hey guys, welcome to the Community Meta, uh, uh, podcast about community in all different types and fashions. Today we're going to be covering dead games. What is a dead game? Is a community the reason the game's dead? Probably. Uh, we'll go on to Mighty to maybe give his definition of what a dead game is.
All right. Well, so, because I believe we have some slightly differing ones. So as far as I define it, dead games are games that you can't play anymore. Even if you wanted to, can't buy it, can't find it, and even if you did buy it back in the day, servers are off and now you can't play it. That's sort of what I sort of would consider it. But they've only really been a thing in maybe the last 5 or so years. And before that, I wouldn't necessarily say that there's as many like straight up dead games in that sort of sense. But the other version that is, I think, far more common that you'll see used online is games that just it's hard to find players, specifically like multiplayer games. Like I don't know about you, I haven't heard anyone call The Witcher a dead game. Um, but you know, for example. But that's more or less the sort of definitions that I'm sort of working from for tonight. I think is that correct for yourself as well?
Yeah, I definitely agree with more of the latter explanation than the first one.
Mm.
Having that great, like, you log on to your game. For example, I've got Zombie Panic Source. Absolutely love that game. If I bid it up, it's just a graveyard of empty servers. Um, and
So
you
does
just
it
can't.
have? So it's still got you can get like dedicated servers for it. Is that right?
I think that community based. Let
Okay.
me. I last logged on about 2 years ago, so back
Yeah,
then
yeah.
there were still community servers, but
Mm.
they were mostly just US only. And
Okay.
well, which is a given based in Australia. Generally, games die out a little bit earlier than you have a US and your Europe's.
Yeah. Especially in Australia, like if you're not playing like the big six games or whatever, um, you almost can't find matches for stuff these days, which is really tragic. I'm low key convinced that there are more games on Steam than there are Australian PC gamers.
Yeah, that's how. I don't even want to go into how many games are actually on Steam. I'm sure someone can
Yeah,
find
it's a
the
mess.
answer.
Oh yeah, I'm sure there's a database somewhere. So, what other games have you got in your library that you would say are like, by your definition, you got the dead games that you missed dearly,
Miss Dealey, I don't know if
or
you would
or feel like you
call.
missed out on as well?
I don't know if you'd call Payday 2 a dead game.
Mm.
You don't really have people talking about it, but I'm pretty confident if I did log on, I could still probably queue into games.
Hmm.
And that sort of goes into that weird definition of is a dead game when only like your niche players are still playing it,
Mm.
uh, which sort of goes across the first two definitions we gave.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Because I tend to subscribe more so that it's like it's dead when it's completely gone. You know, like we sort of talk about community a bit here and things like that, and having a community together kind of quite often a lot of games they don't really have high player counts, excluding like your battle royales and your battlefield and like your bigger battlefields and that sort of stuff. And so if you have 10 friends, you can play most games, like a complete lobby of most games that are out there these days, and have a pretty good time. Arguably like the best time. Um, but I do think that's an interesting one. That we're probably going to argue about a little, not argue. We're probably going to like go back
plus-
and forth over a lot for over the next however long we spend talking about this sort of stuff. Um, yeah, so one of the games that I've got from my sort of graveyard, I guess I could sort of say. Sorry, I'm gonna make sure. Are you um you're done with Payday? Is that right? Or
yeah,
is there more? Is there more?
I I don't know if there's more.
Okay.
I
All right. Well,
Yeah,
interrupt
well,
me if
well,
there is more.
I will.
So, all right. So my one of my bad boys, my sad losses. So I've got 4 in my library. I'm not going to go deep into each of them. But the 4 games that I've got on my little list of, quote unquote dead games are Evolve, Lawbreakers, Battleborn, and Duelist. So sadly, none of those games are listed on Steam anymore. And even if you did buy them, you can't play them anymore. And they all died for a lot of different reasons. Most of them are shooters, because obviously that's my jam, I guess you could say. But they all kind of suffered from running out of players and not enough players to sort of justify arguably to justify the server costs. There is a little bit of that I'll go into a bit later. So of those games, Evolve, Lawbreakers, Battleborn, they all used Amazon Web Services for their hosting, which is crazy cheap, I understand, at scale. And sometimes there is an argument to be made. I actually don't know enough about sort of hosting those sort of titles, but for smaller games that I play and am close to developers and things like that, their costs are really low for hosting their servers. Like they could spend a little bit of money and they could have their servers running for like 10 years on AWS. I don't know if that scales down with volume of users. I suspect it would, because if I remember rightly, they kind of charge per minute in some cases.
Even like a Minecraft server, it's what, $30-$40 for a server for a small community.
Yeah, I think in some cases it's a few dollars a slot. But my understanding is the Minecraft ones are very demanding in terms of memory, I think, which is like a real premium on a lot of the hosting virtual machines.
But even then,
that go for it.
for a company, it's not that
Yeah, exactly. Like if if I'm making a lot of zeros out of at the end of a number regarding sales of a game, you would think that game could at least be available until the heat death of the universe, right? Right.
Correct.
So another game we got that was on my list there is called Duelist. It was a mix of chess and Hearthstone, and it was awesome. That one lasted a couple of years, and unfortunately, it sort of died out. And some of those games have transitioned really strangely. So in terms of like to their sunsetting. So Evolve, for example, actually relaunched with a free-to-play model. Now, I don't know how many people remember Evolve's journey in the gaming space, so to speak, but it was a 4 versus 1 game, similar to Dead by Daylight, where one player plays as the monster, and the 4 other players play as hunters, and they were all class-based. And so it was like you had the trapper, you had the assault, you had the scout, and an engineer, I think is what it was, or the gunner. I can't quite remember, unfortunately. I'm sorry. Anyway, they relaunched the game after it. Sorry, I'll backtrack. So the game released. First off, it had a lot of problems in terms of its marketing was really, really weird. So Evolve was one of the first games that sold pre-orders before any sort of screenshots or media for the game had been released. So, and on top of that, they had 2 season passes before the game was even like released. So you could buy the monster PC edition for like $120, with, no idea what you're actually getting. And that was kind of what a lot of the game's story was in the wider sort of criticisms, at least for that part of it. After it released, some people really liked it. A lot of people found it to be kind of like it was fun, but it wasn't worth the price tag. So it was fun, but unless you really were a kind of player who seeks mastery in sort of video games, and you can really you don't really need crazy things like new maps, new weapons, or new loadouts, all that sort of stuff regularly. There wasn't really much content for the game upon release. They had a couple of really cool modes, but there wasn't like enough to justify the price tag. I think me and my friends eventually picked it up when it was on sale near the end of that particular phase of its life. Shortly after that, Evolve went free to play, which was like their attempt to sort of recoup it, basically on the part of the publisher, which was 2K, who are notorious for killing stuff. And sorry, I'm going to cough again. So, after Evolve went free to play, they rebalanced it a lot. The games got a lot faster. I should mention that in the lead up to this, they had huge problems with consistent balance as well, because it's an asymmetric multiplayer game. Bang! How on earth are you ever going to get that right? So in the instance of if you had a competent team of hunters, the monster didn't stand a chance, but most people didn't play a full stack of hunters. Most people played solo queue. So you ended up with most of the time, the monster was the one who could basically dictate the pace of the game. They had huge balance problems with like DLC monsters after the game shortly came out that went unaddressed for kind of too long, which contributed to the bleeding off the player base. And so after about 3 years, they re-released it. They went free to play. Evolve Stage 2 is what it was called. It was pretty dope. Like, all the changes that they made were more or less the same sort of like accessibility sort of changes that you get as games tend to mature. So in the original game, you had the trapper was the only person who could deploy like the Thunderdome. So when you found the monster, your trapper would drop this dome, and the monster couldn't leave for the duration of the dome. So that's when you actually kind of fought him. In the re-released version, anyone could do that, which was kind of funny because you get your people who love to press W running up to the monster, dropping the dome, and then they're by themselves in there with the monster. Anyway, they re-released it, went free to play, the whole shebang. They had monetization, they had they were getting new content at a pretty good rate, all this sort of stuff, and it did get an influx of new players for a month or two, and then it started to die out again. And then eventually the publisher pulled the plug. In my opinion, it was a bit too soon to do that, because they'd only been free to play for like 4 months, and I think that they were really hoping that it would explode a lot more after such a drastic change in direction for a game that was already kind of they'd kind of shot themselves in the foot with a couple of practices. And so now how it is if you have an original copy, so they turned all the Amazon web servers off. The matchmaking doesn't work for Evolve Stage 2. You can't find it on Steam anymore. However, if you find a bargain bin copy of Evolve with a Steam key, you can still activate it on Steam. You can still access it. And the original Evolve, they kind of preserved that before they went to the Stage 2. You can still play that with peer-to-peer matchmaking with your friends, if need be. So I wouldn't say it's like completely dead, but if you really like this game, the amount of effort that it takes to get a match is going to be longer than the match itself, which then you start asking yourself, oh, is this worth my time? Rada. Opportunity cost. So that was my Evolve history lesson regarding Dead Game. I'll let you. Have you got any other games yourself?
I feel like you're really into Evolved.
I was. Look, I have an addictive personality. Like I've got like 3. I got 3 more to go, man. I could do this all night. No, but yeah. So that was sort of the story with Evolve, and I think that was I think it had potential, but it just kind of, they just called it quits, and that's sort of it. And there wasn't really enough of a community around it when it closed off, if that makes sense, to sort of, or at least a like visibly public community, if that makes sense, which I think is something that we'll talk about a little bit later. Yeah, to sort of keep it going. So now it's just kind of like you can play it, but you really have to work to get it if you really want, and I think that's kind of dead.
I think that's the sort of the difference between when a developer wants the game to die and then when a community wants the game to die.
That's right. Well, I think you go.
It sounds like the community aspects was sort of still there and people didn't want it to go, and then the developers didn't see the sort of return on investment that they were hoping for and just decided to cut their losses.
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, people vote with their feet, and if your player base is quite low, and the developers look at that and they say, well, I guess at some they're all going to have different metrics. At which point they go, oh, I'll stuff it. One would hope that you might have some diehard developers who are like, man, if I just make one person's day better, it's worth it. It's worth it. But unfortunately, at the scale that a lot of those AAA games operate at, that's completely unfeasible, which sucks.
Yeah. And generally, investors don't think that way.
No, yeah, it's annoying. Can we? Yes, different argument there for sure. But yeah, exactly. That's sort of thing costs us quite a few.
I guess this segues pretty nicely into the sort of the implications of how a consumer pays for a product, and then cannot access
Yes.
it anymore.
Yeah, exactly. I've been rambling for a while. What's your sort of take that you've got with this one? How do you sort of feel about that?
Well, it's kind of interesting in the world we're moving towards, where it's sort of going software as a service. So you have your Spotify, you have your Netflix. You're just paying to sort of to own a piece. So that's part of the one side of the coin where software as a service, you're not actually owning it. Whereas, say something like I'm trying to think of a game example where a consumer's paid for say
Unreal Tournament 2004. I've still got all 6 CDs.
uh, yeah, great example. So you own that physical piece of copy, right? Or you thought you did, but in reality, in reality, you technically don't own it if it's software based. It's always going to be owned by a third. Well, it's not owned by a third party in a sense. But it's sort of sold you that idea that you do own their software when you don't, and
Mm.
that's part of the reality we live in when we buy games on Steam, right? Any day, Steam can just go down, and you lose access to all your games. We still buy
Although
games.
I do understand that Steam does have like a dead man switch built in, so that if like Steam Central service implodes, you'll still be able to access most of the titles that you've got regarding their DRM. But like at the end of the day, it's DRM, right? Like it's pick your poison.
But will you be able to download those games?
I would
Steam's
not be able to tell you the answer there. Yeah.
I think it's pretty unlikely. If Steam suddenly disappeared and their servers went offline, you probably aren't going to be able to install your games, and you pretty much just lost all that investment. I think my Steam account's worth something like 11 grand.
Oof.
Yeah, I mean it's 10 years old, so that's
it did adds up over
right?
time. Hey, have I eaten that much? Have I eaten that much food in that amount of time? One wonders.
And that's quite a large investment just to sort of be paying to have access to your game just for as long as Valve is around as a company.
Yeah, I think that's it is a bit sad that that's kind of the way that things are going. Personally, it's the whole like free as in beer sort of phrase that they sort of ask with regards to a lot of that sort of stuff. Like, do you own this copy or do you own the idea that it represents? I don't know. Anyway, yeah, that's more or less.
Where it sort of segues back to my original point where I didn't quite hammer it down. Where when you're on Netflix and you're on Spotify, you still won't have access to that those products that you you don't own them. But you're still sort of paying less for use of the product. I can sort of see our producer, who is quite heavily opinionated in this topic, like biting their lips.
So I think one of the things that I'll ramble a little, I'll circle back to, if that's okay with you, Morg.
Yeah.
Is free to play. So when games decide to go free to play, because it's kind of been a bit of a trend ever since. What was the first game that did it? Probably, I think the first high-profile game that did it was Team Fortress 2. There were free to play games beforehand, but I think that was probably the biggest example of a big change. So of those games that I've listed, in my sort of list, they're like Evolve, Lawbreakers, Battleborn, and Duelist. All of them at some point had some measure of free to play in their business model. Lawbreakers was originally just full price, buy the game, and you get all the content, which was a bit dangerous because it released the same year as Overwatch. No surprise what happened there. Battleborn had this thing where they allowed the multiplayer, like certain parts of the multiplayer, to be played for free without having to buy the game, but it was very poorly communicated how that was available, so it didn't really keep a lot of the players in. And Battleborn released like the month before Overwatch, so like, yeah, Overwatch is a bit of a trend here.
You didn't want to compete with Overwatch.
No, yeah, and a lot of these, like Battleborn especially, they position themselves as a competitor to Overwatch when the gameplay was nothing like it, which was a real shame. And so, and Duelist was free to play from the beginning. So, who knows? Maybe free to play is not a magic bullet. Apparently, you still need to have a game that's worth playing for free, because you're competing with other free games. So the most interesting one I sort of found with Lawbreakers was Lawbreakers had a very small, dedicated community for the time that it was alive. Arguably, like 10 to 20 people who got together and played the game regularly across the world. And it was kind of funny because there were, shall we say, journalists who looked at the Steam charts and go, oh, look, there's like 10 people playing Lawbreakers. Only the devs are playing their game now, which is kind of funny. But what you end up having there, when the game went free to play, one of them made a really interesting sort of statement that I sort of tried to remember a little bit more. And he was basically expressing frustration at all of the new players who were coming in when the game was free. And what was almost always happening was new players would come in, they'd go, oh my god, this game's so good, why doesn't it have more players? Now, Lawbreakers only went free to play after it was announced that it was shutting down. So they basically said, okay, we're shutting the game down in October. From like June, it's going to be free to play for everybody. You can get your last little kicks out of it because, we've given up on it. Exactly. And I managed to get a couple of mates into it, and we had a good couple of rounds with it. But one of the guys who'd been playing it the entire time basically came in and said, no, where were these guys when the game actually needed players? Like, if these guys were, willing to get up and say, hey, this game needs more players, I'll play this game when it has more players. It sort of feeds into itself. Like, the game wouldn't have gotten shut down if those players had been playing. And it's kind of one of those it's one of those sort of, I find it's like a circular sort of thing, right? If you sit up and go, hey, I really like this game, but there's no point in me playing it because it doesn't have players, even though you might be able to find people to play it with, especially if it's like a small 5v5 game or something along those lines. Like, there's 6 billion humans on the planet. You can probably find 10 who like the same video game as you. And so it was a really interesting sort of, I guess, note for the game to go out on, because what had happened was they had a really small, tight-knit community that really understood the game and really, pushed to play it as it was. And then it's like, imagine if you have a really nice house, you got a really, happy little family, that sort of stuff. And then suddenly just everybody rocks up right as the house is about to be demolished, and they're all sort of saying, oh, it's a really nice house. Well, how come they're demolishing this house? It's so nice. But the reason it's being demolished is because you only had, 2 people living in it or something like that. That's a terrible analogy. I'm sorry.
I was wondering where you're taking it.
Yeah. Nowhere good. Anyway, so
I wonder what the implications would have been if they realized that, hey, going free to play, it's bumped up the number of people, and then they just tried to resell the game, where they're like, hey, we're going back paid if we get I guess that's the issue, right? Because people are
Mm,
like, oh, but it's still going to shut down. So if they don't get enough players, we're just going to lose money buying a game that's going to be dead.
yeah.
Um,
I think that
I,
it's one of those ones where, like, because it was shut down, they were like, okay, we announced the shutdown, then we're going to free to play. It's like it's happening, you know, like
it's
there's
almost
nothing
like
we can
flogging
do.
a dead
Yeah,
horse if you
yeah,
if you
like
try to make it paid again.
yeah, short of short of lightning striking and the game suddenly bursting at the seams full of sudden players who came in off the back of stuff. It's like it is extremely rare, but it can happen. Like, look at what happened with Among Us, like a game that was out for 3 years, barely had 10 to 20 players daily, and then suddenly exploded because a lot of content creators and streamers started playing it together. Like, I sort of feel like it's it's not impossible, but you certainly you wouldn't bet the house on it.
Yeah, you can count on probably one hand the amount of times it's happened.
Yeah, if that. um, so that's sort of the weirdness with one of the free to play conversions from like Lawbreakers. The other ones I don't have much to go on. Battleborn had a free to play, but it was poorly communicated. Like, there wasn't a thing on the Steam page that said play for free, or like it said play for free, but then it was a DLC for the full game. It was just confusing. It was awkward. And then
So
Duelist, yeah.
it was killed by bad marketing, or
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, like it was killed by a lot of things, basically. Like, it was one of those games where it wasn't. I'll tell you a secret about myself. I don't mind janky games. So quite often I'll find, like, I really like a game that a lot of people are like, oh, it's like, oh, I give it a 7. So it's like, oh well, no one's playing that. What is worse than a 7? Bring me the forbidden review numbers. um so yeah, so anyway, so I don't mind a bit of jank in my games here and there. I kind of I try to, like, understand what they're going for, and sometimes I can sort of forgive bugs and lack of polish if the core gameplay is fun and enjoyable. But so I am definitely a minority, and the question is there enough of that to make a niche for like, especially a lot of those games are FPS games. Like, FPS games is a very crowded market.
I
These days I think it's very hard to if you launch an FPS that's not free to play, it's like, it's a bold strategy. I think it can work. Like, you look at
Call of Duty.
no, Ready or Not is the one I was going to say. The like an indie one that came out last year. That thing's been on the top selling list for Steam for the last, like, since it came out, which is
I sort
really
of think
impressive.
people just sort of purchase that because it's the spiritual successor of SWAT 4,
Yeah,
and they wanted to recreate that in a more modern way,
yeah, which is great. Like, yes, now we have more options for people, because it's
which
there's a lot
actually
of games where
goes
it's
into
like,
the basis of SWAT 4 being a dead game, right?
yeah, there
And
you go.
then
Yeah,
someone's
exactly. Oh, the
remade,
spiritual successors are back.
yeah, and remaking dead games into popular games again.
Mm-mm. Yeah, and that's the whole, like, nostalgia now as a purchasing pressure. It's wild.
Like
Um
goes full circle sometimes.
oh, yeah, it is. Hey, so I think that's kind of because SWAT 4 had multiplayer, but it was like, was it peer to peer, or was it? I don't think it was dedicated servers.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I feel like it was peer to peer. Um, I guess fact check on that.
Oh, yeah, I'll have to fact check that one, because I think it would have been right when peer to peer was becoming a thing. Around there, it was like the early noughties, when that one came out. So that's sort of where we're at as far as a lot of those sort of wild, sort of free to play um things going. The only other free to play, high profile free to play one that I can think of is there's a game called Rift, which used to be a paid MMO. I think it was like 30-40 bucks. And then they went free to play, and it was I think that was one of those first games that I was talking about that went free to play, and they were suddenly like, oh look, now we can now we've got heaps of players. It was an MMO though back in the day when everyone was making an MMO. So, it's like if you don't like WoW, then you're waiting for this game, and then that game comes out and it's not WoW, so it dies.
I think the other problem of the early free to play games is the trouble of distribution.
Yeah.
It's like when TF2 went big, it's because Steam was sort of taking off as well.
Mm.
So people could download Steam and, oh, hey, a free game,
Yes,
TF2. I'm gonna
please.
take that. And
Yeah.
that's why TF2 is probably one of the best examples of a free to play game going well.
Yeah, it's weird. Like TF2's got a weird lifespan at the moment, because it's like its player numbers are like through the roof. It's doing really well on paper, but it hasn't really seen what a lot of people would call active development for like 2 years. Which is kind of it's kind of like a Valve thing. They'll do a new game out and they'll look after it for a good couple of while, but then they sort of just quietly just lose interest in it, and then that's kind of it for a while. Like
And
TF2
and
is
then
going through it, CS:GO is going through it, Dota 2 probably as well.
and all the
Like,
time the community gives up hope for an update, and then they just give it like a single
yeah,
drop of
and then like
water.
a little one comes out and everyone's like, "Oh, I'm back." Yeah. But that being said, it's those ones do tend to at least try to you certainly get the feeling like they're at least trying to make it better with those updates, even if sometimes it's like unsexy stuff like we've adjusted the ranked matchmaking distribution of the player pool across different different ranks. Like
Oh, I'll say that again.
oh yeah, like, oh, read a patch note to me. uh, yeah, so it's one of those sort of odd ones with the free to play sort of stuff from a community. But so that's more or less. I think that's kind of as much as I've got regarding free to play and the like dead games. So there's a couple of good notes on modding as a way to keep games going. So let me have what's a good mod that kept you interested in a game for a long time, if
There's been a
any?
lot of great mods.
Yeah.
Maybe from like an outside looking in, GTA RP is an
Yep.
amazing example of a mod keeping a game alive.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, GTA's multiplayer, I don't want to call it bare bones because they did end up adding heists and that content.
Mm-hmm.
But you can only do the core gameplay for so long before it's sort of just more of the same. And then GTA RP comes along and allows you to be a paramedic, be a cop, just sort of
Mm.
act out your civilian life, which you'd be doing in an unofficial sense online on the normal multiplayer, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's kept the GTA community engaged long past the sort of um, best before date.
Mm. Well, how old is GTA 5 now? It must be pushing
I want to say it's pushing
6 or 7 years. 6 or 7 years. It was like
GTA 5.
2014, 15 when it came out.
It came out in 2013.
Holy
It's gonna be
cow!
10 years old next year.
Is that the Did it launch with multiplayer though, or do I? For some reason, seem to
I think you're
remember
right.
it's 4 consoles old. That's a much better way to describe it. Oh my god, man! It started in 360p and it's still going. It's still going in 4K.
And people still buy it.
And people still buy it and get banned from it. It's great. So I think like mods are a really interesting one to talk about. So because of well, obviously there's entire games and genres that have come out, basically the entire MOBA genre, the entire battle royale genre, and I think that's mostly the ones that I can think of off the top of my head that are the big ones that came out. So there's a content creator called Soviet Womble who normally just uploads goofy gaming videos, but he actually did a series of video essays that sort of talked about battle royale and the like open world survival genre. And he made a really good point with regards to like DayZ. So when DayZ was originally a mod for Arma, and that functionally had a lot of dedicated servers, is basically how people interact with Arma. And a lot of those servers, if you're a server operator, you want players on your server, right? You're in competition with every other server. And so you're going to start some servers would start tweaking the gameplay through mods to change the gameplay the base gameplay experience, which then led to things like your DayZs sort of turning into like or not, sorry, it sort of led to DayZ sort of becoming its own thing, but the same sort of breeding ground also started to bring out Battle Royale sort of stuff, which was because I think the original PlayerUnknown's Battleground was a mod for Arma 3, before it became its own thing in Unreal Engine. And that's a really good example of mods sort of keeping a game going a lot longer and even turning it into an entire different genre, you know? Like you wouldn't have games like Apex Legends now if you didn't have mods like that were also driving Arma players, you know, like 10 years ago. Which is crazy.
I sort of felt like we wouldn't have gone Arma 3 if it wasn't for like DayZ bringing people. A lot of people came in through DayZ and then realized that Arma was actually a really solid game, and whilst DayZ didn't capture them as their core gameplay, they ended up sticking around for just traditional Arma. Which then went on to produce Arma 3. We got the Battle Royale, and it just sort of stems that across. And that's I feel like there's a whole nother discussion just in general on gaming communities just being created.
Yeah, it sort of mods into like the dedicated servers and modding sort of thing.
Yeah, because like Straightpun and Chat, like Counter-Strike, Dota, all just mods. I think it was it Half-Life that there were original mods for?
Dota was a Warcraft. I know the history here. So Counter-Strike was originally a Half-Life mod, and Dota got popular in Warcraft 3 as a custom map, which was called Defense of Tower Ancients or Defense of the Ancients, something along those lines. But it was actually the actual concept for it was in original StarCraft. There was a series of modded maps that were called Aeon of Strife. Which was basically very similar to what Dota is, and then someone just made Dota. Someone liked that in original StarCraft and was like, "Well, Warcraft 3's map editor is, you know, very good compared to StarCraft's already very good editor. So why don't I take Aeon of Strife and put it in Warcraft?" And you know, that's it. So yeah,
then a legend.
The more you know. Yes, and that series of decisions led to an entire economy like 10 years later. So that's
largest esports in the world. Which
largest prize pool. Largest prize pool is Dota. League of Legends probably has a lot more activity in it, is my understanding. But it depends, you know. So yes, that's the sort of, I think that's kind of the mod sort of context that sort of kicks off there. What else have we got on our list? So here's one I've got for us that's on our little series of show notes. It's this is really good for our internet arguing fans out there. So using Steam charts and Twitch viewership as a judge of whether or not a game is like healthy or good. So aside from the fact that well, I'll let you go first, Morg, before I get on my soapbox. If you have anything, if you got any strong
I was
feelings on that one.
Getting ready for the rant.
You want the rant? You want the rant?
Yes.
I'll give you the rant, mate. You ready? All right, keyboard warriors, rise up. That's right. Come on, let's go loose. Let's get on Twitter and let's get started. No. So, all right. So, Steam charts. All right. I'll start with Steam charts. Twitch viewership is a slightly different one. So Steam charts, right? Comparison is the thief of joy. So quite often people will go, oh yeah, I really like this. We've said this a lot tonight. People will go, oh yeah, I really like this game, but I wish more people played it. Or conversely, the other version is, lol, your game sucks. It doesn't have players compared to when it released. So aside from the fact that that's how time works, like I think there are very few games that can say that they have more players after release than they did at release. I think that number is profoundly small, and if such games do exist, we already know them. You know, it's your Dotas, your Team Fortress, Counter-Strike, League of Legends, all of those sort of ones, right? Most games have got less players shortly after release, which is an interesting thing, right? Because I wonder where all the players come from and where they go. You know, like the first week of I think we briefly mentioned the other day we were talking about what's the Amazon one that came out recently?
New World.
New World. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, ask New World where they go. Exactly. Like, okay, they managed to bring in millions of players upon release. That's a real good effort. Now those players are gone. Where do they go? Do they go back to other games that they were playing? Or were there a bunch of people who were just really hanging out for New World and now there's no New World, or there's less New World, or it's Old World? I don't know. So, like, where have they gone? And it's similar when, you know, when any sort of you sort of chart that with a lot of the primarily like the AAA heavily advertised sort of games, right? Game comes out, everyone's playing it, and then 2 months later, not everyone's playing it anymore. And what are they? I'm always curious to know what they're playing instead of, because it's like everybody comes together for this little party and then they go their own separate ways, but you don't really see big bumps in other games player counts as a new game sort of dips, if that makes sense. Although there have been some hilarious comparisons regarding Battlefield 2042. Basically, like people will be like, "Oh my god, this niche game that's been out, like Hell Let Loose, has got more players than Battlefield 2042." Okay, but did the 2042 players go to different games, or did they go to just older Battlefields like Battlefield 4 or Battlefield 1, depending on where your entry point into the series was? You know,
I think it boils down to just the fear of missing out. So people are generally going to be playing a game longer, like New World, because they're leveling up. They don't want to be left behind. So I personally know my gaming went up from like 5 hours a week to something like 25 hours during the New World hype, because I just didn't want to get out leveled by all my friends and stick around. And after sort of the hype died away, I went back down to just playing my normal amount of video games during the week, and I didn't really go anywhere. I don't generally fit into the MMO niche, but again, there was a lot of hype around New World. Like, oh boy, everyone was playing. If you weren't playing New World, you weren't cool.
Oh no! Oh no! My mom was wrong.
So I think I feel like I'm just sort of typical, right? And the fact of a typical sort of gamer who works 9 to 5, doesn't have a whole lot of time to play. I'm not obviously going to spend all my time on on games after.
Yeah, and I think that's like an interesting sort of I guess, sorry, we've tangented a little bit. But, you know, I think that's kind of interesting with when people start discussing like the Steam charts and stuff like that. It's very, oh no. Oh God, there's already a command for that. So there's I think it's interesting I like to wonder sort of like, where do they go? Where do they come from? But I guess the main part when it comes to actually like discussing games, and you're sort of going, okay, like let's pull up the Steam charts and use this as an objective truth as to whether or not a game is dead. I think that's kind of silly, to be honest, because the people who are enjoying the game, arguably, would just be playing the game, right? Um, and unless it's a game that is heavily dependent on player count, like a battle royale, like for a while, Apex Legends, you couldn't really find matches in Australia, and for some reason now it's just popping again. It's great. Um,
I feel like
but
that's just a matchmaking issue.
yeah, exactly, and I can't wait to do the matchmaking episode. I'm looking forward to that one. Oh boy. Um, so so I think when you sort of basically, if you're using Steam charts as a primarily sort of like a judge of whether or not a game's quality is worth playing, I think that's kind of it's like it's popular, it's good because it's popular, if that makes sense, which I understand is a version of a logical fallacy. But you basically kind of, you sort of judging something without actually trying it yourself, you know? And I think that's a bit silly, more or less, because I think there can be some really good games out there. And a lot of the time, most of those smaller games, you only need 5-10 players to actually play a game. And as long as the servers aren't dead, you know, if you're willing to put the effort in, I think it can be worth it if that's the sort of thing that's worth it to you, you know? Like otherwise you sort of get stuck just sort of, at least for me, you know, you sort of end up solo queuing, and I don't really enjoy solo queuing in team games because they're team games, you know, and if you solo queue, it's like, great, I need to do the whole process, like get to know these people, make sure that we're on the same page, all this sort of stuff. Every single time I do it, and a lot of the time it's just, you know, it's not time efficient in terms of dopamine, you know. You're just kind of rolling the dice and hoping that you get someone who's not going to be awful, and then is also fun to be around, which can sometimes be a quite a crapshoot.
Well, I think a game, you can't necessarily call a game like Human Falls Flat ever dead.
Yeah,
You just need friends to play them. Like it's a
yeah,
very friend based sort of experience. Same sort of Civ 5, but more Civ 5 because it takes literal hours.
yeah.
And
You want
generally
to make
gonna
sure everyone's in for the long run, right?
yeah. Everyone has
Well,
snacks, you know,
yeah.
couple of bottles of water.
Yeah, I actually saw a little while ago there was a community in Stellaris that actually played competitive matches for like it, you know, the matches are like 40 players and it's like 4 or 5 hours long. It's so interesting to sort of watch, and I'm so happy that something like that exists. It's not necessarily for me to do, but it's such a cool sort of expression of people really liking a game and putting the effort in to make it work for them, basically, which I'm definitely
And enjoying the
definitely on
community.
board for.
Enjoying the community enough to want to sort of stick around for 5 hours to
Yeah.
play out a match.
Yeah, well, it was really funny actually. Like one of the ones that I was watching, so the Stellaris community has apparently has, I'm not full bottle on it, but they apparently have got like they've got the people who are like fairly systems oriented, your min maxes, they know how to play, and from a rules of the game standpoint, and they tend to lone wolf a lot. Like you kind of not really worth engaging in the diplomacy in that sort of mindset, if that makes sense. But those tournaments had people who also might not have had that sort of that sort of ability, but they had social skills, and some of them some of them also scammed each other and things like that, which is really funny. But like it's sort of like so much is going on in one thing, it's really hard to capture it all. But it's, you know, I'm really happy that such a thing exists. All right, Stellaris tangent over. Sorry. We should just have like a little bell that we ring. But that's a good point, and that we sprung off of, which was, you know, if a game's more or less just for playing with your friends and things like that, it doesn't matter if you have a wider queue. You know, if you have like a huge player base to play from, if you have just enough people to play that you enjoy playing with, you know.
Yeah, which sort of that's why you can't really use Steam charts for. I'm of the opinion that for some games you can use a Steam chart to call it dead,
Mm,
like your Battlefields.
mm.
You can probably pinpoint the moment where everyone realized, oh, this isn't a great game.
Yeah.
um, but
I think it can also depend too. Like there are some games that'll, when the player counts start to get low, they'll like put bots in, to sort of fill it out, and it's an interesting one because it sounds like a desperation measure, but on the other hand, it means that you as a player can still experience the gameplay loop, versus like just, um, I'm going to click play, and then
ah,
you just sit in queue for 2 hours and nothing happens. Like that's kind of not great. Um, so yeah, I think it's an interesting sort of mix. But you are right. I think like when a game's player count requirement is crazy high, uh, you do need to have enough people playing, at enough times that you can get the matches. For example, like quite often, so I play a lot of PlanetSide. The server I play on during the day, it's like you're lucky to get, you know, between 20 to 50 people on it, which in PlanetSide terms is like it's dead. But then in the evenings, like every evening, it kicks up to like 1,500 people. Like, oh, sorry, 1,500 is too much. Like you can kick up to between like 700 to like 1,100 people playing, each evening. But there's like half of the day where the server's dead. How do you sort of figure that out? Do you just average it out? And that's another game where it's got an independent launcher. So even Steam charts won't pick up players who are using the game's own launcher without having it linked to Steam. So, how do you tell?
that's really interesting on 2 points. The first one, which is the more basic point, where having the like it not tracking the launcher is definitely a good reason why you shouldn't just look at Steam charts. The second point is sort of the community aspect of games that are persistent. So, like your Planet Side or like your Foxhole, where matches go on for literal days. I'm not sure how long a Planet Side match would go
It
start to
never
finish. It
ends.
never
Oh,
ends.
it's sort of like the closest thing PlanetSide's got is that the continents kind of rotate, like, and those the criteria for them changing are usually like about 5 to 6 hours would be the longest between them. But usually they can sometimes change every 2 hours. And when they are about to change, there's like an in-game event where it's sort of you've got like an hour and a half to try and like go hard to win the continent, and then that way your empire gets a little bonus, and everyone goes, "Oh, look, this empire's winning." Um,
So
um,
the point of sort of the persistent war. I'll
yes,
go the foxhole with this. Foxhole is a bird's eye view. I think it's World War Two, and then you
it's like
have two
World War
sides,
One and a half is
one
my
and a half.
understanding of yeah.
Okay, so you have two sides which are both trying to destroy the other, and wars go on for days. It has sort of two gameplay aspects of it where you have tons of people on it during the evenings where it's
Mm,
just all out war. But then during the day, the people who are on and can put effort into the well put everything into their war effort. It's sort of in sort of maintenance mode where you try and
mm,
maintain everything until all your main players get on for the evening.
yeah. Yeah, it's super interesting like that, isn't it? Like it's just the unstoppable passage of time has gameplay implications. All right. So I think we've kind of rambled for a good hour or so there. So I guess close. Have we got any sort of closing thoughts? Basically, I didn't even get to the Twitch stuff, the Twitch or the viewership stuff for content creators, but the short version of it is, there's like a critical mass that you need to make it look like a game is more popular than it actually is. And in some cases, that critical mass is available for money. Anyway,
I
Anyway,
think the entire conversation can be boiled down into a dead game isn't black and white.
yeah.
It's very different depending on the different genres, and yeah, you like how we
It's-
open. There's multiple different definitions of a dead game, and they're all
mm,
they're all correct in some way, shape, or form.
yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. I think, and it's just making sure that whatever metric you're using for the comparison, remembering that comparison is the thief of joy. Just have fun with your life. It's gaming's a hobby. You should be enjoying it. Um, just
Wait, we're
make
meant to be
sure that
having
you.
fun.
Wait, what? Since when? Are people having fun on the internet?
No.
Anyway, yeah, but that's more or less it. Like just make sure it's not really, if a game's not your style, hopefully you can just find one that does work. And if it is your style and it's worth the effort to make a gameplay experience for it happen, I definitely sort of feel like it is worth it if you enjoy the game that much, to connect with other people so that you can do that. But I can also understand why, as far as video games go, like you say, not everyone's got all that time to do that sort of stuff because most people work jobs. They end up, like you just want to turn on game and start playing game. And that's kind of where a lot of the matchmaking stuff does make life a lot easier for it, just at the cost of human connection.
So on that note, thank you for tuning in to the Community Meta, a
Quick,
podcast
stop us.
about gaming communities, and we'll hopefully see you next week, unless we're cut after this one.
Lovely. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Wow, I hope you enjoyed that show. And if you want to make sure that you stay up to date with everything that Game On Aus has to offer here on YouTube, make sure you click the subscribe button. That's the best way